Hello, welcome to Virginia Time Travel, your portal to the Commonwealth's past, present, and future. Belgium has its Hercule Poirot. London has its Sherlock Holmes. San Francisco has its Nick and Nora Charles. And colonial Virginia had Archibald Mercer. Archibald Mercer is quickly becoming one of the gods in the pantheon of great detectives who have fought the Napoleons of crime through the centuries. And we have today as our guest the author of the Archibald Mercer Colonial Detective Series, my very own colleague, Mr. Andrew Mills.
Thank you.
Welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you. It's a little different being on this side of the screen.
On the receiving end?
Yes.
Well, now you'll know how it feels to be heckled by the host. And let the heckling begin. I understand that you have two new Archibald Mercer books out.
Yes.
And one of them is called The Burning Palace.
Yes.
Now, I think the thing that's very intriguing about these books is that not only are they really great mystery stories, but they're really based on historical facts and historical characters. So, what is The Burning Palace?
Well, The Burning Palace is a story that takes place in December of 1781. It is a setting place in Williamsburg, and it deals with the governor's palace. Now, if visitors go down to the governor's palace today in Williamsburg, they'll see this magnificent building. Little they realize it's actually a reconstructed governor's palace. The original one had burned down in 1781, just about 2 months after the victory at Yorktown. And
how did it burn down?
Well, therein lies the mystery. No one's 100% sure exactly how it burns to the ground. We know that a fire started just before Christmas, and because the building is very old wood, if anyone is used to burning things, knows it goes up very quickly. Well, whole governor's palace, before a fire brigade could even get out there and really kind of get the flames under control, is going up. The main building, at least, is going up very quickly. And so the building had been used as a hospital towards the end of the American Revolution for the sick and the wounded men coming out of Yorktown, and they were all inside of there. And so because the fire was going up so quickly, many of them got trapped. And they were running up to the upper levels into the cupola of the mansion as they're screaming out for help. There's this famous scene of how the citizens of Williamsburg are racing throughout town looking for ladders, running them up, and the problem is none of the ladders can get past the second floor. And all these men are on the third floor and on the cupola, which is like the equivalent of the fourth or fifth floor by today's standards. And so they're trapped up there. And then as they're up there, they're screaming for help. Some of them are trying to get out of the cupola and attempt to find some way of escape. Maybe they can run down the roof and jump onto something else, like a tree. All of a sudden you hear this, according to some reports, you hear this snap, this massive crack, and next thing you know, the whole thing comes crashing down. And it just tumbles down to a stop, and then it crashes a second time. Because little do most people realize, but the actual main floor of the governor's palace is a big giant slab of marble, and underneath it was the cellar, and so the marble floor collapsed from the weight of the building.
Yeah, that's truly amazing. And that's not made up. That is an actual...
That is exactly how it happened. It was burned to the ground. In fact, the outer side buildings would remain in Williamsburg up until the Civil War. And when the Union soldiers under George McClellan came through, they ended up destroying the buildings. Colonial Williamsburg itself virtually disappeared off the face of the earth.
But when I first read that story, the first thing that sprang to mind was the Twin Towers coming down. And I thought, you know, this was fiction just based on the Twin Towers.
No,
this was an actual historical event.
This was an actual historical event. It really did occur just like this. With people's memoirs of this, it varies a little bit on description of exactly how the events all unfold, but the basic general narrative reads the same way, that the fire started, the alarm was raised, and before they could actually get the flames under control, the whole thing came crashing down, and they had to do it afterwards.
And so from the late 18th century all the way up until 1920s, there was nothing there?
Well, no, there actually was something there. It was a high school. Colonial Williamsburg got built up into a modern town. You still had the College of William and Mary, so you had that as a base. You did have Truro Parish, because that obviously you can't just destroy a church. But a lot of the other buildings which have been there were long since gone. And so what happened is that Colonial Williamsburg went through a revival period where it was decided, let's bring back the old buildings and let's try to resurrect it. And so during an archaeological dig, it was the location of the governor's mansion was discovered. But what was also discovered was that this high school, which had been built on top of it, when they dug it up, they discovered the bones of soldiers who were in the basement crushed to death because of the weight of that floor coming down on them. And the reason why there were soldiers who were sick down there is because they were the dying. There's nothing that could have been done to help them. They were guaranteed to die, and so nobody would have to listen to their moaning if you put them underneath a thick marble floor.
Interesting. Very evocative story. I mean, it really sets your imagination going. Now, without giving the plot away, Archibald Mercer encounters a lot of interesting historical characters, and once again I thought, oh, well, he's just put this in here. This couldn't be true. And you talk about the English general Banastre Tarleton.
Banastre Tarleton is rather famous in Southern American history, even Northern American history too, for during the Revolution. Banastre Tarleton, the first time you really kind of get his name is through the capture of Charles Lee right before the Battle of Trenton in 1776. And it's one of those more famous moments in American history that a lot of people kind of say to themselves, you know, this is a peculiar guy. He's often kind of describes a bit of your dandy kind of guy, very effeminate features.
Well, what I remember about him is he was very vicious.
Well, he was rage militaire. That's basically that was kind of his mentality. Tarleton is often referred to as an individual who would take no quarter when it came to American troops surrendering. He would fire on men who were trying to offer surrender. In fact, Americans would go ahead and call out Tarleton's quarter, which was basically take no prisoner.
And I believe that the evil English officer in the Mel Gibson movie The Patriot was patterned after Tarleton.
He was very loosely based around Tarleton. Tavington, as you know in the film Patriot, dies at the end. The real Tarleton never died. He actually would live and go on to serve actually a very notable career. He became a member of Parliament after the American Revolution, and aside from one brief lapse, he would remain in Parliament for a great deal of time. He would be a bit of a minor role character during the whole end of slavery for England with William Wilberforce. And he would go ahead and he attempted to take the position that the Duke of Wellington had during his campaign against Napoleon.
Well, the thing that I remember most about Tarleton was that he led this raid to capture the entire Virginia Assembly, and he came within a hairbreadth of capturing Thomas Jefferson. And he did capture a couple of the assemblymen, but they were such small fry that he let them go. And one of the assemblymen was actually Daniel Boone.
Well, that is true. At the time, you know, Tarleton, of course, was looking for the bigger name people in Virginia. And one of the things that happened was that Tarleton, he actually went to Monticello and thought about burning the building down to the ground. And but he was so impressed by it and its architectural beauty that he decided not to. And Tarleton was actually not in Yorktown when Cornwallis surrendered. He was actually outside of the lines. But when he found out, he did decide to go ahead and surrender. And so Tarleton is certainly one of the interesting figures that gets discussed a bit in Burning Palace. You also have General Rochambeau, you have Nathaniel Greene, you also have George Wythe. And so you do have some notable figures in Virginia history and American Revolution history who's brought up and mentioned by name. And even locations play a role. You have Williamsburg, you have Baltimore, you have the small town of Nancock in Virginia's eastern shore.
I think one of the things that's great about the books is that they work on several levels. I mean, you don't actually need to know any of this history at all for it to be a good yarn and a good story. And at the second level, if you do know the history, it's even more interesting. And at a third level, you have some real gold nuggets here of minutia that even the most knowledgeable historian is going to learn something if he further investigates and researches.
And then that's the beauty of the whole story.
So it's almost a mystery within a mystery within a mystery.
In a lot of ways, and that's the beauty of it, is that it's a mystery. It's a good read. It's something that you can enjoy to read. So if you just want to sit down and have a nice something to read, just to pass the time, it gives you that. But if you enjoy kind of exercising your mind a little bit, trying to figure out what's going on, it does that for you as well. But at the same time, you kind of learn something, and that's why in the stories you always have this author's note, usually at the end, which tells you the truth behind a lot of the figures and the events, so that this is how the historical record reads it, and you can kind of discern, oh, well, this is how this figure, the characters can interplay, and it kind of makes it very intriguing in that way.
Well, I think the other new Archibald Mercer that you've just brought out will really appeal to political junkies, especially here in Washington and Northern Virginia, and that is about the election of 1824, the so-called stolen election.
Yes. A lot of people think about the stolen election. Some people would argue that's 1876. Actually, the first one was in 1824. What happened is that in that particular election, you have James Monroe. He's retiring as president, and it's time to go ahead and have a successor. Now, a lot of candidates start to come to the field. In fact, the biggest candidates that were starting to show up were Andrew Jackson, who was governor of Tennessee, hero of the War of 1812. A lot of people supported him. You had the Secretary of State at the time, John Quincy Adams, coming into play. He was certainly very popular. You had William Crawford, who was seen as a bit of a moderate and maybe a unifier. You had the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay. Even John C. Calhoun briefly thought about going into the presidency, but then opted instead to go to the vice presidency because it was just such a weak field. He knew he could win that. And so when the election came forward, Jackson won the majority of the votes, but not a majority necessary to go ahead and give him the presidency. And so what happened is that according to constitutional law, the top three finishers will go on to the House of Representatives. And so the top three in order were Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, and William Crawford. Henry Clay is eliminated. And so what happens is that through the House of Representatives, John Quincy Adams becomes president. But right as he's becoming, this vote is occurring in the House, there's this rather strange article that comes out of the Colonial Observer, which is found in Philadelphia. And in it, they claim that a member of Congress said that Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams had conspired to steal the election from General Jackson, and that that's why Adams is the winner. And it really kind of takes a lot of credence, namely because what happens is that shortly after the election, in forming his cabinet, Adams will choose Clay to be the Secretary of State. And a lot of people in the early...
So there was a lot of political intrigue going on even then.
Well,
I think a lot of people don't realize.
What most people don't realize is that the Secretary of State was basically the jumping off point to becoming president. If you look it over, George Washington's Secretary of State was who?
George Washington, Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson.
Who became our third president.
Right.
Who was Jefferson's Secretary of State?
Madison.
And who was Madison's Secretary of State?
Monroe.
What happened to all those guys?
They all became president.
And then Monroe's Secretary of State was?
John Quincy Adams.
There you go. So if John Quincy Adams' Secretary of State is Henry Clay, that means the seventh president would become Henry Clay.
There you go.
And so there's this belief that Henry Clay jockeyed himself with Adams to guarantee the line of succession for himself.
And so the mystery is all involving this political intrigue. I think a lot of people think the past was a lot simpler, but obviously it wasn't.
It's a lot more complicated. It's a lot more difficult. And the thing is that in a story like this, the great mystery is who in the world made this claim?
Well, one of the most popular Archibald Mercer's book is The Female Stranger, which revolves around the disappearance of Theodosia Burr Alston. Who was Theodosia Burr Alston? Why was this such a big deal when she disappeared?
Well, Theodosia Burr Alston is one of those figures in American history that I think a lot of people are going to go, huh? Unless you come from South Carolina, you've probably never heard of her. Theodosia Burr is the daughter.
Although at the time, when she disappeared, this was like a national event.
Well, it was a notable event. I wouldn't necessarily refer to it overly as a national event, but certainly it's kind of like the equivalent of, say, Jenna Bush, like when she went ahead and stuck her tongue out at the media driving by. Oh, the media made a big push. Oh, look how rude she is, and there she is next to her father. But after a couple days, it all blew over. Theodosia Burr is the daughter of Aaron Burr. In fact, she's his only daughter. And Burr had actually raised her almost like a boy, in that she had a very fine education. She was a very well-versed young woman. In fact, Gore Vidal put out the theory that the Burr-Hamilton duel was based off of Hamilton making a comment that Aaron Burr had an incestuous relationship with Theodosia, and that's why he went ahead and shot her. There is no confirmed truth to that whatsoever, but we do know that she was named after her mother, and Theodosia would go ahead and marry Samuel Alston, who became governor of South Carolina, and the two did have a son who died in 1812. And so in the start of 1813, Theodosia was going to sail north to New York in order to meet her father, who was returning from exile in Europe. And on her way up, her ship just disappeared. A lot of theories have come out as to exactly what happened to her. There are some stories saying that she was killed by a pirate by the name of Dominic Yu. Another story has her being washed ashore down in Texas, of all places. And then there are...
It's an intriguing story. As I understand it, one of the stories says she was made to walk the plank.
Well, that's this Dominic Yu story. She was made to walk the plank. She apparently cursed them, and then she went ahead and jumped in, swam around a little bit, and then just kind of relaxed and dropped into the water. The most romantic story is the fact that she was Alexander's famed female stranger. Does anybody actually know if that's true? Well,
I guess Archibald Mercer will get to the bottom of it.
Exactly. It's up to Mercer.
Now, as I understand it, you are now conducting a mystery tour in Old Town Alexandria based on this book?
Well, A Female Stranger is probably the most accessible, and it's one of the most famous stories commonly looked up by a lot of visitors of Alexandria. And so it seems kind of natural to go ahead and just tell the story of the female stranger. And in a lot of ways, people do that, but it's always in the small snippet, and it's kind of like, well, you know what, I'd like to learn more. And so that's the beauty of the story, and kind of creating a bit of a walking tour around it, is that you can go ahead and walk around the streets of Alexandria. You can see these very important places that are all around town. You get a feel of exactly what the community life was like, and then all of a sudden, there you are in the middle of this mystery.
And so this is an interactive mystery?
It's an interactive mystery. It allows people who go ahead and take the tour to go ahead and they assume the role of one of the figures of the story, be it either historical or fictional. And you'll go ahead and go along with Mr. Mercer as he tells you the story, and you try to determine if you can figure out exactly what's going on.
I see. Very good. Now, one of the other books, The Stolen Sash, it deals with George Washington and something called the Conway Cabal.
Well, the Conway Cabal was a situation of where General Washington in 1777 found himself in a bit of a predicament. And what happened was that there was an attempt to oust him as commander-in-chief of the army. And so Horatio Gates had created this this new position as an inspector general and gave it to Thomas Conway. And Conway was very critical of Washington. And so what happened was that Washington very famously would put Conway back in his place, indicating that, you know, if you make your way into camp, you always report to General Washington first. If you're going to have to report anything, you report to Washington, who then reports it to Congress. And you know, it's basically this one continual thing. And the cabal really kind of collapses on itself. And a lot of people say Horatio Gates was behind it, but Conway takes the blame because he's the face guy. But in this case with Mercer, he finds himself somewhat embroiled with the Conway Cabal and Horatio Gates, as you kind of see them attempting to take down Washington. And in a lot of ways, I think what makes this story unique is that you meet a much younger Archibald Mercer compared to some of the other stories, and you discover he is very much an interesting young man in comparison to the way he is as a much older, wiser man. And I think that's one of the beauties of the story is that if you look at Burning Palace and you look at Stolen Sash, both of them have a much younger Mercer. as compared to Female Stranger and Stolen Election, which has a much older Mercer. And so you see this younger self and then that older self, and how as one person he grows a lot.
Now, do you think that historical fiction is like the gateway for a lot of people into history? A lot of people say, oh, history is boring, it's dates, I don't want to learn about that, but historical fiction kind of eases them into it.
I think historical fiction helps you, kind of gets you a little bit of interest in there. You definitely want to learn more about the characters. You want to know who these people are. Some of it does require, it makes you think, oh, it couldn't be real. Let me look it up. Oh my God, it's true. And so I think it helps to kind of get you into it. It certainly will help move things along. Yeah, historical fiction isn't for everybody. I mean, there's the hardcore history nuts who would say, oh, it's just a mockery of history. Well, okay, then read the standard, dull, dry history book. For those that like history, but they want it to be a little bit more exciting, this is the avenue for them. It gives them what they look for.
And certainly, if it's an area of history you're not used to, sometimes it's easier to read fiction and get interested in some of the people. I think you yourself have famously said that history is really all about the people. Mm-hmm. Now, I got interested in Roman history by reading some historical fiction, and I got interested in some of the Roman characters, and then I wanted to know more about it. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the stories that's a lot closer to home is in The Gambler's Den, and that centers around a famous story from Alexandria.
Mm-hmm. Gambler's Den revolves around the story of Michael Kiggins. Michael Kiggins is famously known as the night watchman for the old Alexandria Cotton Factory. One night he's brutally murdered, and the police attempt to find his killer, and so they stick a dummy up in the cupola that looks a lot like him, and the killer never returns. And so in this case, it's up to Mercer to find the killer. In using his own powers of deduction, he sure enough finds the killer. But there's an added twist to the end that kind of ups the ante a little more. It kind of gets the reader more engaged into the story and wanting to find out how it continues.
But that dummy is actually still in the cupola.
Yes, it's still
of
very
the
much
old,
there.
Cotton building on Washington Street in Alexandria.
Still very much there, and ironically enough, the building is now the home of the International Chiefs of Police Association. And so I don't see that.
Ironic.
Rather ironic. I don't see the killer coming back anytime soon.
So Sherlock Holmes was based on Dr. Bell. Is Archibald Mercer based on a real person?
Well,
or was he a real person?
Well, Archibald Mercer is a very interesting and unique figure in American history. I mean, he was an aide-de-camp to the Marquis de Lafayette, served briefly under the command of General Greene. He had some run-ins with George Washington. And this is a man who seemingly would always find himself anywhere and everywhere, but one of the things that kind of makes him interesting is the fact that he never outwardly tried to make himself seen. In fact, he always kind of pushed himself away from the limelight. As a young man, he was always looking for it, but one of the things I find that's interesting about this particular individual is that as he got older, he didn't want it so much, and realizing that the fame and celebrity that you have can sometimes turn against you. And when it does, it's not exactly something you really want to have. So it's been very interesting tracking this man's life down and trying to pinpoint everything to him. As far as I know, there's only one portrait of him that actually exists. And even he mentioned in his own diary, he hated posing for the portrait. And so he told the artist to make it look a lot more heroic than what his wife wanted. So it's the only one of its kind. Even then, he says, I never thought it actually looked like me.
Well, we do know at least what his favorite dish was.
Yes, he enjoyed the gentleman's pie in Gadsby Tavern. He was a very fond memories. He always spoke highly of that, seemed to go ahead and order that the most. There are accounts of him talking about the gentleman's pie in his diaries, indicating that it was good today or meat was a little burnt. Always a bit of a critique, to say the least.
So what other Archibald Mercer stories can we look forward to in the future?
Well, the next one coming out is called A Game of Wits. and that's coming up in the very near future, in which case you can also expect to see other stories coming out. There's Mercer dealing with the Jersey Devil, and there's Mercer also running around all across America, but as much as I want to go ahead and start giving you all the titles, I think you're going to have to wait and see.